Okay, so to my viewers, welcome back to Live Each Day with Purpose podcast. I am so excited for my guest I have today. His name is Nick Reynosa. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Well, it's Nick, but yeah, you got it. Yeah.
He's 31. He is a Marine veteran and a graduate of San Jose State University. He has volunteered in the pro-life movement for over 10 years. He is the former Northern California and Nevada Regional Coordinator for Students for Life of America. His writings have appeared in National Review and lifenews.com, and he has been quoted by the New York Times and NPR. Nick has high-functioning autism, which is what we're going to be talking about. He is passionate about mentoring young adults with autism through supporting them and their families to thrive and better understand themselves and discover their purpose. And as you guys all know, this whole podcast is all about living each day with purpose. So Nick, welcome. I am so excited. Nick and I actually talked previously. Guys, there was so much good questions I got from that conversation, like things that I learned that I just never knew. So I just know that this is going to be a really inspiring podcast episode, but it's also going to be one full of like awareness and education. So like, Nick, why don't you tell us about your story?
Yeah. So thank you for having me on. So when I was growing up, when I was very young, there were a few memories that stick out to me. Like I remember when I was young, I had like very strong headaches when I was very little, from about the time as early as I can remember till about 12. Mm-hmm. And another thing I also remember was having sort of special skills. Like was a really good memory, and my understanding of numbers was probably like 3 or 4 years ahead of other children. And so when I was about 5, I remember being in school and the teacher saying, like you should skip him a couple grades. And I remember that was my first kind of understanding of feeling different. And ultimately, I decided not to skip the grades because I felt they tried it out for a little bit. And I felt even more awkward because I would go to the older classes and I would still be bored. And then I felt really weird. And so I told my parents, I was like, look, just put me with the younger kids. It's fine. Looking back on that, I don't know if that was the best decision. I think also, too, you have to understand what my parents were going through as well, because my father's mother had schizophrenia. And I feel like there was a little bit of shame or stigma there. And so anything with mental health was like a very touchy subject for them. Even like some teachers had said that I may have ADD, and they were hesitant about that as well. And so I didn't get diagnosed with anything, ADD or autism, my whole childhood. And I just kind of kept along that path. And then I remember just kind of struggling, socially, not to the point of being like totally isolated, but struggling. And when I got to about 20 years old, I had a breakup with a girl, and I was very heartbroken, and I was trying to kind of do an autopsy to try to figure out what went wrong. And I started reading about personality types and different left side brain, right side brain, different things like that. And it started to click for me and understand. And I started reading the, symptoms of autism. I was like reading my biography. It was like all the things were lining up, and it made sense to me. And then when I started trying to better myself, understand myself better, I could cope better. And as I got more independence, I became happier, and I had more success with women, and I had more success with my career and more independence. And now I'm at a place at 31 where I feel very happy and fulfilled. But it was a long journey. And I would say it took probably about 10 years, of hard work to get me where I'm at now. But I'm very happy to be there, and I can share those experiences with younger people so they can kind of speed their own process along.
Yeah. During our previous conversation, you had talked about how it was like 16 to 21 was like the most difficult years for you.
I'm sorry.
No. Can you tell us why that was? And
well, I would say the most difficult year was 16 to 17, but then those 5 years were also very difficult. And the reason for that is before 16, you're basically a child, and you're very sheltered. And around 16, there all these major changes start, people start driving, they start dating, they start working. And so you're kind of like violently shoved into this quasi adulthood. And so your little clique of friends when you're 14, 15 is a completely different clique of friends sometimes at 16 or 17 because of those changes. And I remember just feeling so out of place that first year and feeling very alone, and all the awkwardness, all those things that I was struggling with were kind of brought to the forefront very quickly. And then I had to deal with that fast. And then, so I struggled, and a lot of young men, I feel like, struggle very much during that time, and they cope with depression differently during that time. But as they get older, they get away from home and they have more independence, I think the adjustment starts to improve. That's why I highlighted those 5 years.
What helped you get through those 5 years?
Oh gosh, I think that some of it I didn't get through too well. I mean, I was depressed. I always say, idle hands are the devil's playground. So always keeping busy. I always worked a lot. I went to school full time. Exercise can help. Not having a lot of like dead space, because when you have dead space, that's when depression can accelerate. That's when thoughts of inadequacy can accelerate. If you're being productive and you're looking at your life, you're like, wow, I finished this much school, I did this much work, I saved this much money. You avoid negativity by being productive. But if you're not being productive, you look inward and you start to be like, what is the point? I'm a failure, whatever. You start to have these negative feelings. So I would say definitely stay productive, exercise, and waste as little time as possible. And those have been outlets that I've found that help me cope well.
What was like the biggest support, or like what made the biggest difference in helping you get through and work through struggles that you encountered because of autism to help you succeed? Like you had mentioned your mom just like being so content in life despite what she went through. Like, because I'm
Well,
sure.
yeah, I think it's being positive and having a spirit of contentment. One of the things, the most important thing about contentment is expectation. So having ambition, having realistic expectations, but also not beating yourself up, and also being grateful for what you do have, realizing where you came from, realizing that there's people that have less than you. So having a spirit of contentment, setting realistic goals, short-term goals, and that helps a lot. And a sense of gratitude and all those things. But I learned that from my mother. And also time heals a lot of things. If you're working and you're being productive, your life at 31 is going to be better than 21. That's just time. Time is always going to help. So those were all things that helped me.
And like, I like what you just said, because like, those are actually things, I mean, contentment, gratitude, that's something that would help us all. I think at times, in our own lives, we can all have unrealistic expectations, which will just set us up for disappointment. How can parents help with their kids, like for those parents that receive, like when they receive a diagnosis of autism, high functioning autism, whether they have young children or, teenager children or, adult children, what is there to help those parents when they receive that diagnosis? Like what resources are available to help them know how to navigate this?
Well, I think a lot of times understanding what autism is, the gradations and gender differences, just acclimating yourself to the severity of the situation. We're going to talk about comorbidity, but understanding, okay, what is the diagnosis in full? Because you want to get a diagnosis, first of all, because that may help with insurance or resources. You want to understand, is it high functioning or is it not? You also want to understand the comorbidity aspect of it, because let's say, for example, a child has ADD as well. Well, the medication may be helpful. Like I would have loved to have had medication. I didn't as a child, but it would have helped, because when I started taking it as an adult, I was like, wow, this really helps, So understanding sort of the spectrum of the problem, and then also the severity of the problem, because then that can help you manage expectations. So for example, a person with high functioning autism can be a billionaire, but a person with more severe autism may need a caretaker. So understanding those expectations as well. And then even with if you get into like the dating stuff, like a person with high functioning autism can be married and have kids and so on. Someone with more severe autism, that's less likely to happen, and so understanding the probabilities and stuff like that as well. But I haven't really worked a lot with like official, like, because I haven't had a child with autism, so haven't worked a lot with like official organizations like that. But the most common type of therapy that parents are offered is a thing called applied behavioral analysis. And there's some controversy in that because some parents believe that that is trying to engineer behavior through like punishment and sort of mold a autistic child into a neurotypical child. So it's very controversial. I'm kind of on the middle on that because I think for young children, you need to tread lightly. And also, depending on the severity of the autism, you need to be a little bit gentle and understanding. But at the same time, so there's a difference, for example, in how weird a behavior or how different a behavior would be. So for example, like stimming is something that it's like, I do this where I'll rub my hands together, right? That's a self-stimulating behavior. This is not really that abnormal. Like I could do this talking to you and you wouldn't really notice it. But if I was like, when I was a child, I used to do this thing where I would like chew my shirt. That's kind of a little bit farther on the spectrum of different, right? So like if I had a child, I would maybe do therapy to stop the shirt chewing thing, but the hand thing would be like, oh, it's okay, you're fine. So, and also like, as long as they're not doing anything that is very socially inappropriate, like if they're just different, like when I was in college, I never took notes. I just listened. That was my personality. I like to do that. That's fine. Like being different is not wrong. It's being ineffective or being or something that's interfering with your life thriving or succeeding. That's a problem. And so I would tell parents to seek out therapy that addresses those more specific things, but not to tell their child to not be autistic, to make them neurotypical, because that's taking it too far, I think. It's like a child that's left-handed and you're saying, well, be ambidextrous. Well, no, you're left-handed. You're always going to be left-handed. Like, don't change that. But at the same time, you should have good handwriting. You can be left-handed, but have good handwriting, right?
Yeah, I liked what you said. Because, it's like when you have a hindrance, like if something's hindering you from really being able to meet your full potential, then yes, that would be an issue. You brought up a couple of things that we actually are going to talk about. One is comorbidity.
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned how like you could have autism and then ADD. For a lot of people, that term isn't well known. So can you kind of go a little bit deeper into?
So a background. So all psychological disorders are in this book called the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, right? For psychological, from the American Psychological Association. Autism is in there. ADD, which is attention deficit disorders, in there. Bipolar, OCD, all the things are in there, right? Now, when you're dealing with a young child and you think, well, what's going on with this child? Does this child have autism? One of the interesting things is when you're observing them, you might see comorbidity, which is when you have more than one medical condition simultaneously. So for example, myself, I have autism, but I also have ADD. Other children they may exhibit characteristics like autism, but also have speech delay. They may have OCD tendencies. They may have, sensitivities to sound or light. And so when you start to see a lot of these things simultaneously, I would really suggest that like if a child has speech delay and their OCD and their ADD, like I would really suggest that the parent go and get some kind of testing for autism done, because then the indicators are becoming more clear. And it's also important when seeking out diagnosis that girls are underdiagnosed, because generally, if we look at the data that we have, which isn't perfect, that it's like 90% male that we know of, but that may be because girls aren't getting diagnosed because they're masking it better. They have better nonverbal cues and so forth. And so that's another. So for example, a female autistic person may manifest that in an intense introversion, like they're very shy, but they might not have as many outbursts as like a male and I'm not saying this, oh, I'm generalizing, but I'm just saying it might not be as in your face. It might be just more intense introversion. And so it doesn't go diagnosed as autism.
Yeah. Do you think that's because of, like with men, it's like the testosterone. And so like they're just by being men, they're more kind of like, like aggression and stuff like that. Not necessarily in a bad way, but,
And women may on average have higher emotional intelligence, so they may have better nonverbal cues. They may word things. They might use more of like an I language instead of you language, and so they might be able to build rapport better, and so that might mask some of the things where it's less intense, and so people don't assume those antisocial stereotypes or something like that.
let's talk about terminology, because like you'll hear someone say autism, or they'll use Asperger's, or they'll use high functioning autism. And I think it's good to know, for those who have autism, like what we should be referring to it as, to not offend. But I think just as education, we should just know which one we should be using.
Yeah, so when I was growing up, Asperger's, what they now call high functioning autism, was a term that you heard quite regularly. And when I read about it and I thought, well, I have this, I didn't mind saying that I have Asperger's. But now the professionals have really shied away from using that term. So I would say that there are two main things. There's more severe autism, and then there's high functioning autism. And two of the biggest characteristics of that are speech. So like I'm able to speak in a normal way, and also I'm able to live independently. And usually those are the two biggest things between someone who's high functioning and someone who has a more severe case. And so some of the major term, I mean, there's a lot, I'm going to try to briefly go over them, but the first one, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. So that's kind of like the official test. So if you've got a young child, they're displaying a lot of these characteristics, I would definitely go get that test done. And if you want to get a second opinion, that's fine. Do that, because that may help with your insurance or getting more resources down the road for them, like the applied behavioral therapy or some other type of cognitive behavioral therapy. And then also, so delayed speech is a big thing, and there's several terms with that, like, and not only that, but nonverbal communication. So like me gesturing to you that I'm listening, eye contact, gets into those things of like emotional intelligence or lack thereof. And that's one of the biggest things through therapy and life experience, where you can build that emotional intelligence over time. Compulsions and structure. So remember I talked about the comorbidity with OCD. So things having to be a very certain way, in a similar way, structured. It could create comfort, but a taking away of that structure, even if it's rational, can really be even traumatizing for some. I mean, for me, I never really had those feelings, but I definitely think for some children that structure is really comforting for them. And then, here's a really interesting one. So there's this term called echolalia, and it's this idea that children will repeat phrases over and over. It's also been called movie talk. I never really did this as a child, but I do remember as a child having a very strong auditory memory. So I could remember very well, but it was specifically related to my hearing. So like if I heard a lecture or if I heard a song, I could remember in great detail what I heard. So oftentimes that delayed speech might manifest itself in sort of a repetitive speech. It's called echolalia. And then so emotional regulation. So these are the outbursts. So children with more severe autism, they may have tantrums or self-injurious behavior, like they smack themselves. I mean, I never really did anything like that, but that would be a more extreme example of the self-stimulating behavior, but in a more uncomfortable way, because they're emotionally upset about something. Let me see here. So nonverbal communication. So there's this term called eye gaze, where like when I think of this term, I think of like two sisters or two best friends who are women who have like really good nonverbal communication, so they can just like look and they can just like have this conversation between each other. And that's something that, for example, like a young child, because a lot of times when like a young child is irritating someone, they're not going to say you're irritating me. Their body language is going to say it first. Their tone is going to say it first. And a person with autism, it just goes right, like they're not picking up on the subtle stuff first. And then they're like, no, really, you're getting on my nerves. And so I think behavioral therapy can help you realize how your tone, how your lack of expression can cause, and we're going to talk about later, but emotional contagion, it can spread. Like if you have a resting, what face, that can spread to people, and people with autism don't really realize that. They just think, well, if I'm like glum, then that's my business. It does, but it actually affects you because it makes you glum, So I'm just going through that. So there's terms like hyper responsiveness that might come from like light or touch, physical touch, and then hypo responsiveness, which might come from like a lack of reading cues. Okay. And then here's an interesting thing. So when playing with toys, young children who are neurotypical tend to do pretend play, like I'm a princess or I'm cooking in my easy bake oven or what. They're pretending to do something. Oftentimes the reason they do that is because it's more social, right? It's more fun to do things with people. But someone with a very like strong left side brain, like an autistic brain, is more interested in things than people. So for example, they want to take the toy apart and tinker with the toy. They're more interested in the toy than what the toy accomplishes. Like, I don't care that I race the truck. I want to take the truck apart and put it back together. So it's a less social thing, but it's more a mechanical inclination, right? Non-functional routine. So that's something that like I have a structure. It might not be the most efficient way. It's just a way that makes me comfortable. Or if I'm ADD, it just keeps me pacing. It just keeps me active and fidgety. I don't care if it's wasting time. It just lets me be active. That's another thing that's happening. And yeah, it's a preoccupation with parts and objects, things over people, and repetitive language. They might say things. Oh, I know one young child who likes to say like, excuse me a lot, excuse me, because she's trying not to interrupt, but she's saying like, she's just trying to be polite, but she's doing it in a very repetitive way. And speaking of the stimming, we talked about the self-stimulating behavior. Like that can actually get to the point where it can be harmful. Like I remember that I used to do that with my hands to the point where my fingers would actually bleed because I did it like so consistently. So like it's definitely something that behavioral therapy can help you realize that you don't have to do this. Like taken to an extreme, it can hurt you. And also, when they're doing the diagnostic test for young children, social imitative play, which is like when they are mimicking other people. Generally speaking, when young children don't do that, that may be a sign of autism as well. So that's pretty much all the main ones. But I hope that's helpful. I know it's a lot to take in all at once, but I definitely think there is some overlap between like ADD and OCD. Particularly, you'll see some of those behaviors could also diagnose those things as well.
Yeah. So like, how do you keep kids like with autism engaged and focused and doing activities to help them with autism? Like you had mentioned kind of tinkering to avoid boredom and just to keep them from losing focusing. Like, what are some examples of activities that they could do?
One of the biggest problems with like your garden variety school is it had a one size fits all model. So think about this, like going to the gym and everyone lifts the same amount of weight. Like that's crazy, right? Like we all lift different weight because we're all at different levels, but school says you all have to read the same amount of pages in the same amount of time, take the same test on the same day. And that can drive autistic kids crazy because they're like, well, I don't need that much time to study. Maybe I want to study something harder, faster, but you're not allowed to. So definitely allowing them to do stuff at their level. If they're more advanced, then push them. If you do that through independent study or through homeschooling or side projects, I would totally recommend that, because if they're going to get bored and they're going to get disengaged, then they're going to not do well in school. And that's really a shame, because it's probably something they could be one of their strongest suits. And they would waste that opportunity. And also, if they are more advanced, let's say they skip grades or they graduate early or whatever, that's going to give them an opportunity to make more money, to be more independent earlier. And then they're going to find that happiness that I talked about, time, fixing things. Well, if you're able to get out there and have a career at a younger age, you might experience that even younger. So I would just say, always challenge them, always teach to their level, and, allow for independence. Like I would say, do your homework the way you want to do it, but make sure you do it. Because an autistic kid be like, well, why do I have to do it? So tell them, yes, you have to do it, but you can do it creatively and you can do it at your level. So I think that's a good compromise. And I think those are ways to keep them engaged.
Can you talk about the low emotional intelligence and communication struggles that someone with autism has and ways to help them?
Definitely. So a lot of times people with low emotional intelligence are very like goal oriented. They're very like linear. They're like, I want to get to point B. I'm at point A. How do I get there logically? But oftentimes there needs to be a little bit of emotional grease when interacting with people. Like, for example, let's say you're on a dating app and you like this person and they like you and you match. So clearly you both are somewhat interested in each other logically, right? You're both open to like having coffee or whatever. So the autistic person thinks, well, like, I like them, they like me, let's just go get the coffee, right? Like that's a logical thing. But you can't just be like, first message, okay, 7:00 Thursday, we're having coffee. You can't, that's not how social interaction works. You have to make people feel comfortable. How do you do that? You might be like, oh, I like your photo, I've been to that beach, or you just say some kind of small talk thing to make that person feel comfortable. And then as you become more friendly with them and the conversation is more natural, then you could be like, oh, are you free Thursday at 7 or whatever? And so I feel like the lack of it, it's just like goal oriented, very logical. Or if you say something like, oftentimes people will recommend, don't say you language, say I language. I'm feeling frustrated, not you're making me frustrated. People with low emotional intelligence will be like, no, you are making me frustrated. So they want to say you because that's what they're thinking, but they're not realizing how that's going to impact other people. Or if people, or let's say your idea is wrong. Like, let's say you say 2 + 2 = 5. And the autistic person's like, 2 + 2 does not equal 5. Well, that person who's wrong may feel like you're attacking them personally, not their idea. They're not distinguishing between the idea and them. Like you're saying, I'm wrong, therefore I'm stupid, therefore I'm not good enough. And so having emotional intelligence is realizing how your words affect people. And so you can strategically speak in a way that greases the conversation a little bit better.
One of the things that you had said in our previous conversation that really stood out to me regarding that was that people with autism are just very logical. And so, like, sometimes they kind of like stay on something. And it's like, no, that doesn't make sense. It's like this. And like you can't kind of get them off of that, but it can kind of make the conversation, it's
confrontational. Yeah, it can make it. Yeah. So like, for example, I've made girlfriends that I've had before cry, and I wasn't even trying to make them cry, because like I would say, like, look, if I was never born and you were never born, the logic of what we're saying is always the same. It's nothing personal, but they're not hearing it that way. If I got hit by a truck, what I said still makes sense whether I'm here or dead or whatever, but I think that understanding logic is important, but people have to be receptive to the logic. And if they're shut down, then they're not going to care about the logic, and they have to feel that you care about them too. And so those are all important considerations, I think, and you grow over time in that.
So, like, are there other differences between like the brain of someone with autism and the brain of someone who doesn't have autism? Like, are there other differences that you could kind of talk a little bit about?
Well, I definitely think like in nonverbal communication. So for example, if I was talking to you and I was looking down, you might think I'm not listening, but I may be listening. I just don't have to give you those nonverbal cues and gestures to let you know. I remember my grandmother used to say, Nick, eyeballs, look at me, like, because I wasn't looking at her, you know? And so definitely, I think there's a lot just like social norms, you know, like, for example, there was a really interesting test where psychologists would have like lines that were longer and shorter, and they would put people in a room with a bunch of people that they had planted there, and they would lie about which line was longer and shorter and give people like a social pressure. And you could get almost anybody to say the shorter line was longer if the whole room turned against them. And so a lot of times autistic people have this gift, I think, where they don't care what people think. And if they really think something's logical or important to them, they will be in the minority. And that can cause problems too, because let's say, for example, that you're in a very like specific religious community and everybody is that religion and everybody marries a person of that religion. And an autistic person's like, I don't know. They're not even against it. They're just like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not going to say I believe it if I don't. And then they don't get married or whatever because they're not following that group norm or whatever. But they're like, I don't care. I care more about being right than following the group. So I definitely think there's a very strong independent streak there. And for children that are more on the severe autism spectrum, there may be more asexuality where they just don't care about relations. They just want to be left alone. I don't think that's really common on the high functioning, because most high functioning people do want to date. Even if they don't, they still want to. And so I think not just logic, though. We talked about different types of intelligence. So for example, they may have speech delay, but they're very smart with quantitative or numbers, math. They might be better at engineering or what's called spatial intelligence, 3D intelligence. And so it's like, when you think about your brain, it's like a pendulum. So sometimes when something's strong, something's weak. So for example, like musicians might be blind, but they have incredible hearing. Well, that's exactly like autism. You might be incredible at math, but you don't speak until you're 3 years old, you know? So like there's a balance going on there, you know, or you might be able to be extremely logical, but you never cry or you never hug people. So I think it's a balancing act with all of those things.
You talked about marriage, and in our previous conversation, you had mentioned that a lot of people with autism don't get married. Like, why is that? And what can parents do to set their children up for success so that they can have healthy relationships and like change that fact?
That's really important, because I think when I started doing research and first kind of diagnosed myself, that really scared me, because I mean, I read different studies. One study out of Canada said that 9% of autistic people get married. I've seen another study from Spectrum News that had it as low as 5%. And so imagine like a doctor came to you and was like, well, you have this injury and there's a 9% chance you're going to recover from the injury. That would be kind of like, you'd have to take a minute to kind of like process that. You'd be like, that's hard. That's a hard thing to hear. And it still scares me, because I'm not married right now. And it's something that I think about a lot. But I think it is possible to overcome. So what are some of the reasons? So I think that women, so let's start with men first. So like, I think that women really value emotional intelligence. They value humor, they value communication, they value support, being listened to. Charm is a way of making things that are awkward seem smooth, right? Something that is, at first meeting, someone who's smooth can make that feel natural, whereas someone who's like overly logical or like they're interviewing you or something, that makes it even more awkward. So I think that generally speaking, men with autism have low emotional intelligence, and that's something that women value a lot. And so men need to work, or autistic men need to work on their emotional intelligence, because they're not on average going to do well if they don't improve that. And then for women, I think it's a different thing. I think that oftentimes it manifests itself in like extreme introversion and shyness. I knew this one girl who was female and autistic, and she was extremely shy, but very beautiful. You're thinking like, this girl could get any guy, gorgeous, but very, very shy. And so she was like in her late 20s, not married, didn't have a boyfriend. And it was the shyness. She just didn't put herself out there. So I think on average, that's probably happening with females who are autistic. But I think it can improve because, for example, I started looking at things using the applied behavioral analysis, not in like, why are my conversations failing? I just looked at a good conversation. Like I would watch like a video or a movie or something of an interaction between a man and a woman where the man was charming. What made it charming? Well, he made it engaging. He made it lighthearted, simple. You build rapport. You can't talk about like extremely deep things instantly. You have to ease into it. And so, and also too, people do not want to be interrupted or bothered by a stranger unless you have something engaging. So you have to bring something interesting to the table in a lighthearted way, in a charming way. And then once you build that rapport, then people will give you a lot more opportunity to be yourself, because then they are emotionally connected to you. And they might not even care. I mean, I've been very fortunate to have partners that didn't care that I have autism. They know 100% that I have autism, but I had to earn that comfort with them first for them to care. So I think that's a big part of it as well.
You had talked about, there was something that you said and I was like, oh, that was so good. And you said it, when we first talked, and you said autism, it can be a disability, but it's also an like ability at the same time. Like there's pros and cons, and there's strength and weaknesses with both. Can you kind of like explain that? Because I know some parents are probably like, oh my gosh, like we got this diagnosis, or a child is probably like, oh my goodness, I have this diagnosis, and it might seem like the end of the world diagnosis, but I mean, you have such a positive outlook, and I know you've struggled, but like you're such a inspiring testimony of hope. So like tell them what those strengths, what those weaknesses are, and just how it's an ability as much as a disability.
Well, like memory, for example, oftentimes you'll have a very good memory where you can hear something or read something once and remember it for years. Also with your IQ. So there is a variance here though, because sometimes children with severe autism may have lower IQ. However, on the high end, they could have extremely high IQ. Like my IQ is in the 99th percentile. My IQ is about 140 at least. And learning that when I was struggling, when I didn't have as many friends or I didn't have dates or something, knowing that about myself, that I had an IQ, really made me feel better about myself, because I was like, well, in this one little box, I feel good, And so, so getting your kid tested in general IQ, or in specific, more like quantitative intelligence or spatial intelligence, that can really build their confidence for sure. And realizing, just looking at historical examples, like Elon Musk has autism, Bill Gates has autism, amazing people have autism. There's quotes about how the world, if autism doesn't exist, the world would be a completely different place, because it's been changed by so many people with autism, and they all struggled as well. So finding hope in that, but also recognizing that you have to put work into yourself, because on my best day, yes, I have had relationships and I have had success, but on my worst day, I have been sad and alone. And so what is the difference between that? It's the work that you put in to better yourself, to learn from yourself, and to know that the thing that breaks my heart the most, like my father has a friend who's in his mid 50s, also autistic, never really got the help that I got. And he reminds me of myself at 20, but he's like 55. And that really breaks my heart, because he didn't get that help. And so understanding, like, there's a huge spectrum of how your life can turn out, and seek out the help. There's no stigma to it. There's nothing wrong with you, but with that help, you'll improve, and you might have things you didn't even think you could have. Like, you're like, I don't think I can get married, but then you come to the point where you're like, yeah, I can get married, or I can live alone, or I can have a career, whatever the case may be. And so I just being hopeful, but also being honest, honest about what could happen, but hopeful about what could happen. I think that's the key, and understanding the strengths and the weakness.
What is approach anxiety?
So this is something actually that's not specifically autistic, although I think autistic people suffered a little bit worse. So for example, like, let's say there's like the most popular guy in school or the most popular girl in school, and everybody wants to talk to them or be friends with them. People may feel nervous about walking up to them and starting a conversation and making it feel natural and not awkward or whatever. So that's a human thing, not an autistic thing. However, because autistic people have experiences of like maybe 10 times in a row, they tried this and it didn't work out, or they felt awkward, or they felt rejected or whatever, that approach anxiety intensifies to the point where they might just give up. They might be like, you know what, I'm not good at this. I'm like socially blind. There's something that it's just not clicking with me. I felt like that when I was young. I felt literally like blind. I was like, there's something that's going on here that I literally cannot see, because I would have so many interactions that didn't turn out the way that I wanted them to turn out. And I started to realize by just observing other people interact, that's how I kind of clicked for me that I can defeat approach anxiety by understanding what makes a good interaction possible. What are the foundations of a good interaction? And so I think it's something that we can all relate to. It's just, it becomes more debilitating for people with autism.
One of the things that I like that you had said previously is that, autism, like people with autism, they seem to be a lot more braver than people who don't have autism. Because, you had mentioned it's not a thing of like whether or not they care what other people's opinions are. Like that doesn't really
Yeah.
a factor. And so, like there might be something that there could be someone with autism, someone without autism, and they both want to go after it, but the person with autism like would be more likely.
Definitely.
And yeah. I love that.
I've seen that in my own life because I live in the Bay Area. It's very liberal, and I'm pro-life. And some of the times I'll go to protests and stuff, and it's like you're in like downtown San Francisco, you're protesting abortion, very controversial. And I'm like, my pulse doesn't get above 70. Like I'm calm and I don't care. And I'm thinking sometimes when I'm doing it, I'm like, I'm probably one of the only people that will do this. And it's probably because I'm autistic, because I don't care. Like, I think abortion's wrong. I think it's immoral and I want to stop it. Therefore, I go out there and do it. And I'm thankful for that, because if I was a neurotypical person, I might be like, well, I don't want my friends on social media to see this, or I don't want my liberal friends who I love to think I'm like an extremist or a weirdo or something, but I really don't care. And so it helps me to be brave and to do the things that I want to do.
I love that. You kind of had mentioned a little bit earlier in this discussion today about structure. And we had talked previously about just the like familiarity and routine are so comforting, and how it's so important to keep a routine, like especially for parents with kids that have autism, like to keep that routine. And like, can you kind of go just a little bit deeper into like why it's so comforting and why it's so essential to have that structure and routine for them, for people with autism to be successful and succeed?
That's interesting, the part about the success, because I don't know. It definitely would make them feel more emotionally comfortable. And if they're more emotionally comfortable, they're more likely to succeed. However, if it becomes rigidity to the point, like, for example, your parents would be a lot more accommodating than your boss. So understanding how rigid you can be in the context is important. I think that some of it that overlap I talked about between OCD and autism, some of it may be OCD manifesting itself with, say, the emotional reactions of autism. So it's complicated. But I do think that when you're very much in your own head and you're introverted and you're isolated, you might not have that many that broad a social circle, that your own world structure provides safety. It provides familiarity, like some people extroverts derive their energy from like going to a party and being around people, but introverts might derive it from solitude or their own little sanctum that they have. And if my little world that I've created changes, then you're really you're really treading on my territory, because I've created this safe world for myself, and then you're changing the structure. So some of it, I think, is that introversion or that privacy that they really value. And some of it, I think, might be that OCD that is overlapping with the autism, and it's okay to a point, but you don't want it to be rigid and affect your career, your life.
What are some tips for like, because I mean, this world is not going to be like like a routine, like nonstop.
Definitely, yeah.
It has so much
Mhm.
flexibility. So when things change, because I mean, a lot of people as is don't like change, but I mean, for autism, when there's a change, what's the best way, coping mechanisms or tips to make that transition to that change
Mhm.
and do it well so that it doesn't hinder them?
I think one of the things that helped me so much was seeing things through the perspective of the person I'm talking to. And the way that I did that was by studying personality types. So I memorized the 16 personality types. And like you told me, you're an ENFJ. That helps. So just knowing that one little thing about you helps so much, because when you meet people that, for example, like structure and organization, then maybe you can ratchet up your structure and rigidity because you have a simpatico person right there with you, right? But then if you're around someone who's more scatterbrained and artistic and creative and messy and all these things, you're going to drive them crazy being that way, you know? So I'm very cognizant of when I meet people, either asking them their type or trying to figure out their type very quickly, because I'll be careful about how I word things, how stubborn I am, how rational I am, because with someone who's a very much a feeler type, you can't throw logic at a feeler type. You have to throw empathy and compassion and understanding and all those things. So just being aware of that. I mean, it's hard for young children to do that because, I mean, that's definitely something I would recommend for young adults, but it does help because a lot of these things are not like right and wrong. It's chocolate and vanilla. It's a preference, and understanding people's preferences help you communicate with them.
I love that. Can you explain exactly, because you had mentioned it, emotional, is it, can,
Contagion.
yes, that, can you explain that?
So emotional contagion is, so think of like, when you think of people that smile, I think of like, waitresses or flight attendants, or like, people that are in the service industry, they're always smiling. Why is that? Because emotional contagion happens when someone's not smiling. They could be completely happy, they could be having the best day of their life, but if they're not smiling, you think they're not happy, and that can be like, that can transfer on to you. It's like if I yawn, you might yawn, you know. So if I'm like super stone faced, you, that could possibly make you feel like there's a problem even though there's not. And so I try to smile a lot more. I try to make eye contact a lot more, have open body. Like closed body like this seems very closed off. Even though I might not be closed, it just seems closed off.
Right.
And so opening things up, being positive, because it makes people less defensive. You don't want people to be defensive. You don't want people to shy away from you. And so I think that awareness of emotional, you use it to your advantage, because once you have uplifting emotions, you get people in a positive state, then you can take the conversation to the next level and get to where you're going.
Yeah, I really like that. Okay, so how do you help someone with autism who's experiencing frustration because of the struggles that they're going through with autism? Like, what are some tips to help them with that?
Well, like there's nothing permanent about a temporary problem, and so like depression, you can be depressed on Monday and happy on Tuesday if you are able to have something to work towards on Tuesday or something to look forward to, and understanding that oftentimes the difference between, say, depression and happiness can be a very small change. Like, for example, you could go from having no friends to, say, having a couple friends, and your happiness could go from very low to very high. Like, you don't need a huge life change to make your happiness level change. Or you could go from one job to another and immediately your happiness increases significantly, and so having hope to realize, tomorrow's another day, and I don't know how well it's going to turn out. So I should be optimistic, because you don't have to have a perfect life to have a content, happy life. And having, those realistic expectations that I talked about. And also too, realizing, again, using the examples of maybe things that don't turn out well, like, for example, I know my mother just went to the funeral of a young man who committed suicide. And she was talking to me how, as a mother, that would devastate her. And when she told that to me, I remember thinking, well, it gives me a perspective on my actions affect other people. So the feelings that I feel could potentially devastate my mother as well. So it gives you that sense of a responsibility outside yourself. And so you work to better yourself, but also for people you care about as well.
Yeah, I like all that. I guess for like parents who see, like, especially children, because I feel like, as we get older, like, we better know how to like handle our emotions or even just articulate our emotions. But for children who are young, diagnosed with autism, and they know something's different, they know they're having a struggle, but like
Mhm.
they just don't know how to fix it emotionally or deal with it. What's the best way for whether it's a parent or a teacher to help them when they're outwardly expressing frustration and they need to kind of be like, okay, like, breathe, like, like, how do you help them when they feel so out of control?
I think this kind of gets into this can be more controversial, the applied behavioral therapy thing, where um, telling them, their actions have consequences, like you have a reputation, and people, unfortunately, are not necessarily going to be the most sympathetic. So if you have outbursts, you might be the outburst kid. You don't want it, and there's consequences to that. And so I think finding perhaps children that are also autistic, but a little bit older, and helping them to understand, like, okay, if I'm, say, 10 years old now, the sum of my decisions between 10 and 17 is going to be who I am at 17, and then 17 to 27 or whatever the age is. So that get them thinking ahead and realizing my actions have consequences. People are not going to give me a free pass because I have autism, because at the end of the day, you have to adjust to the world to some extent. And so I think that realizing that it's not that you're changing your behavior, it's that you're being strategic about your behavior. You're saying, I have a goal. I want to get along in life. How do I get to that goal? I don't have to change who I am, but I have to be intentional about what I'm doing to get to that goal. And
Yeah.
so I think that, and if the kid thought, then the kid would think, is this outburst worth it? Like, am I real? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Am I getting what is it really worth it? And I think if they thought about that, it's just like when I go back to the being logical thing, like, is it really worth it to be right in a relationship all the time? No, it's not. Like, sometimes you don't have to be right. And sometimes you don't have to have an outburst because you realize the cost is too high. So I would suggest that as well.
I really like that. In our previous conversation, you had mentioned suicide ideation. So how is suicide ideation? How does it tied to autism?
So I want to be very careful here, and I don't
Yeah,
want to like judge people who are autistic and say they're all suicidal or they all have
right,
suicide ideation.
right.
But what I do want to get at is, if we know that on average kids that are autistic are going to have fewer friends or be more isolated, forget the autism part. Just being isolated and having fewer friends is going to make you more likely to be depressed. And if you're more likely to be depressed, you're more likely to have suicide ideation. So a lot of times what you're seeing if an autistic child has suicide ideation is not autism. It's a manifestation of the pain that they feel from the symptoms of autism, the isolation or the lack of friends or whatever. And suicide ideation isn't like I have a rope in my hand and I'm going to hang myself right now. It's a sense of a lack of direction, a lack of purpose. It's like, oh, I'm just going to work to pay bills. Like, what is the point of all this? I think for my own experience, I remember a time when I was working very hard, but I was alone. I was living alone. And I was like, why am I working so hard? Like, what is the goal of all this? And about like 3 months later, I met a girl and we had like a 1 year long-term relationship. And that relationship gave me a purpose. And all of those thoughts went away, because it wasn't that I hated being alive. It was, I didn't have purpose. And we need, everybody needs purpose. Like they talk about the deaths of despair, like people on opioids and stuff, so they die of opioids. That's not because they hate life. It's because they're sad in their present tense of life, you know? And so they're coping with it poorly. And I think suicide ideation is really a product of loneliness, not a product of autism. But we have to be, as autistic people, we have to be aware that we're being social and that we're not being too lonely, because that can creep in there as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's like what you just explained was really good. How does autism impact one's senses?
So for example, myself, like I really don't wear like jewelry or hats or glasses, or I wear very light clothing. I don't like things touching me. Like I'm very much like sensitive on that. I don't like bright light. I don't like loud noises. I don't think I have it as severe as like some children that might have like outbursts from it, but I definitely have sensitivity to senses for sure. I think you might have the self-stimulating thing may also be related to sensory. Like you need something, you need to be like licking your lips, or you need to be like touching your hands, and that could also be related to just sense stimulation, not necessarily the senses, but your senses need to be activated, you know. And I think the biggest thing with that is just the difference as far as like the emotional comfort, because a normal kid might see a bright light or a loud noise or a touch and they don't care, and then an autistic kid just loses it over it. So it's more of like that emotional intensity from it, not the actual stimulus, how they respond to it, you know. And so and for me, I don't know, I just try to be subtle about it. I try not to emphasize it too much, because I don't want to be dramatic about it. And it can change too, as far as like if you really trust someone, like, you know, a hug from your best friend or a hug from your girlfriend is completely different than like a stranger touching you. You're like, whoa, you know, like you get so I definitely think it can change with a certain level of trust. It can improve.
How can parents help children who have like sensory sensitivities, especially
Mhm.
like tied to autism? I mean, and kids can actually have these sensitivity to sensory type things even without autism. Like how can parents help kids that do have outbursts because of stuff happening with sensory?
It's difficult because each child is different and the severity is different, but like I would say that it depends how the child would describe it, because if the child is describing it as like a visceral, like a repulsion from something, that's not something they can like cognitively think through. But if it's something that they're like annoyed by, then the cognitive behavioral therapy can tell them like, hey, I'm annoyed by this, but if I do an outburst, then there's consequences to that. So maybe subtle forms of communication, like I'm uncomfortable now, can I move from this area? Or you're making me uncomfortable, can I move, can we stop? So it's more of like they can still have an aversion to it, but it has to be more subtle. And whereas the kid who's having the visceral reaction, that's almost like a biological problem, you know, because it's something completely outside your mind. You just have a revolt. So in that sense, you probably have to maybe change the lighting in your house, the drapes, you know, you'd have to very structure the environment in a way that wasn't reactive to them, you know, it was something that was causing a reaction. So I think it's careful to see how much therapy can help and how much of it's just a physical problem.
Yeah. Can you touch on like the social struggles that are associated for someone who has autism?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is, you know, we all are social creatures. The most autistic person in the world is a social creature, in the sense that when I think about what I do with my life, like I'm going to the gym later today and I've lost like 30 pounds. That really doesn't matter unless you have someone to share it with. Like going and telling your friends, hey, I lost 30 pounds. Hey, I did this at the gym today. That makes it fun, the sharing part of it. Like you could offer me a trip to like the Eiffel Tower and the pyramids and the Colosseum tomorrow. But if I had to go by myself, would I want to go? I mean, not really. I wouldn't want to go. I would want to go. I would want to share it with someone. And so that is the struggle, and the beauty of it is that if you don't have someone to share your life with, then life can seem kind of pointless, and you can lack that joy in it. But when you have, and so it's not so much that autistic people can't build rapport with people. It's just that initial phase is, because I've always found with my friendships and relationships, once I get past the initial phase, it's very much like a regular friendship. It's just that initial phase. It's that getting over that sort of formality of the small talk and the, kind of talking about nothing and getting into really getting to know someone. And then when I get to that phase, I find that I'm able to maintain friendships and relationships. And so, and I think that sometimes people will get so lonely. There's a thing called learned helplessness where you get discouraged and you just give up. And I would really recommend that people with autism not do that, because if I had given up, I would not be anything close to who I am today. And I think that, once I discovered success with friends and relationships and so forth, I never went back. Like I never devolved back into what I was before. I only grew. So I think that's important as well.
What would be your message to parents of a child with autism? What would be your message to someone who has autism, especially a child who, is learning that they have autism and not really understanding what autism is? They just, things just.
I think, especially for the ones with high functioning, like just take ownership of it, have pride in it, have pride in who you are, and take ownership in the fact that there are two paths for you. You can kind of ignore it or not deal with it and not learn. An attractive quality about everyone is someone who learns from their mistakes, right? And you have to be willing to self-examine yourself and say, well, the only thing in common with my life is me. Like every other person, the only thing in common is that I'm in it. And so what is the factor that's causing this lack of success? Is it that everyone are just a bunch of jerks, or am I doing something? So have that ownership. And then also feel lucky, because just like someone who say is born with the gift to sing, or they can hit a baseball really far, they have this superpower. You might have the superpower to not care what people think, or you might have the superpower to have a photographic memory, or you might have the superpower to be ahead of kids in math by like 5 years right off the bat. You just understand things so much more quickly. Or that determination to build a company, to work 80 hours a week, or whatever that superpower that you have. So own that, be grateful for that, and say, I don't want to waste that superpower because I have something that I struggle with. It's something that I can overcome. I might never completely overcome it, but I can fix it, and I can harness my superpower to live a good life. And for parents, just understanding that there's no shame in getting help. It's not your fault, and that you want your child to thrive, so they need to get the help, but they also need to be accepted for who they are. So it's a balancing act there as well. And but definitely, I think there's much more hope in focusing on those good examples, and just trying to figure out, how do I make my kid an example like that?
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yes. So if there's like one sentence that I tell all the young kids that I meet with autism, it's that when we think about like medicine and like illnesses and stuff, a lot of times we think of cures. And so I always tell them that if you're happy being autistic, that if they came out with a cure for autism and I have this magic pill and you could take this pill and change who you are, would you take the pill? I know the answer for me. The answer is no. I don't want to change who I am, because I like who I am. I like my strengths. I'm working on my weaknesses. And hopefully every young child can get to that point where they don't want to take the pill. And I think that's the beauty of growing and thriving with it. And I hope that all the people listening, that one day they get to that point as well. So
I love that. Nick, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. There's just so much good content in this episode. I just know that it is going to be inspiring and just like such a good like episode of education and awareness. And I just know that's going to help so many people that, are struggling or have autism, or parents that don't know what to do. So thank you so much. I just want to remind all my viewers and my listeners to remember to live each day with purpose, no matter what you're going through. And, even use it to make a difference one day, one life at a time. You never know what you might be going through or what you might be overcoming or what you might have that could be used to help somebody else going through something similar, and the difference you can make in their life. Again, Nick, thank you. And
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to come on. Take care.